Hello and welcome to our Town Hall meeting for July. This is the 6th in our series of 8 prior to this year's general election. Now, we continue on the theme of Pray, Vote, Stand, because at the beginning of the year, we felt that these were the headings which were needed to be discussed in such a forum. Now, I'm not sure about you, but I'm personally exhausted in trying to keep up with the deterioration that we see happening in our society. Over the past month, there's been a whirlwind of trouble from gangs. For example, taking over the township of Apotiki, government ministers displaying their arrogance, another government-sanctioned move towards separatism. We continue to see our freedoms being withdrawn and a continual shift to the left, away from democracy to Marxism. Now, I want to share with you a couple of Bible scriptures as they form a foundation to today's discussion, which may be a little bit longer than the normal. The first one is one I've mentioned many times from the psalmist in 33:12. Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. The other is from Isaiah 5:20, which reads, Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. You know, there's no doubt in my mind, and probably in yours, that things in New Zealand are taking a turn for the worse. It's kind of like we turned at the intersection and we're travelling on a road that we're not overly comfortable with, and yet we believe Google Maps that we're on the right road. Now, you know, I shouldn't diss Google Maps. They've taken me down countless side roads that have left me thinking, really? But I've always arrived at the destination. Well, how about you? What's your destination? Maybe it's a question you can't answer because you're either not in control of your own destiny or you refuse to take control. Now, to be honest, the latter is probably correct, as there are many today who just drift along. National Party leader Christopher Luxon was correct in his comment about New Zealand and New Zealanders. We've lost our mojo and we've become a whiny nation. But the question can be asked, why? Well, I don't know if you remember, but back in '81, our country was divided during the Springbok rugby tour. Thousands took to the street to protest the South African political regime practices of apartheid. The protesters in a country across the Pacific Ocean, far away from South Africa, showed both the people and the government of South Africa the world doesn't accept apartheid. But instead, we're seeing separatism happening in New Zealand. But is the outcry from New Zealand being muted for some reason? Where's the fire that was in the belly of those people back in 1981? Where are they today standing up for the inequity that we're seeing being foisted upon this country? Rather than bringing all races together, we're separating them. If we're being honest and watchful, we'd agree that separatism isn't just about race. It's also about the rich and the poor, as the vaccinated and the unvaccinated. And I'm sad to say it's still an issue in this country, and it hasn't gone away. It's the separation of families. A huge division is actively happening now. It's Christians versus secularism, and the list, well, it's quite long. Divide a nation, and then it can be conquered. But who is it that's conquering this nation at the bottom of the world? You know, this tiny nation, which is so insignificant, has been forgotten by some map makers and hasn't even been included when they put the world together. Often in the past episodes, I've discussed when New Zealand will be asked to make a choice about our allegiances. We all agree. We want the freedom which democracy affords us, but at the same time, we're a capitalist nation which relies heavily on trade, which comes from the unholy alliance with China. But who is it today that's fighting for the hearts and minds of New Zealanders? You know, I mentioned the word Marxism earlier. New Zealand, a country built on Christian values and morals, has moved from the source to another as we practice social justice. Now, don't get me wrong. It has a place, or should I say the ideals of those who originally brought the format to fruition were honourable, but it's now been hijacked. Today we're seeing social justice in a secular format infiltrating into our church society, and on the surface it sounds great, but reality provides the opposite, or produces the opposite. As a nation, we're not blessed by God, therefore we won't receive the blessings God can bestow on us. We're missing out, and if you want to challenge that statement, I'm more than happy to debate it. New Zealand underwent a huge cultural change at the turn of the century, where we just flicked the switch and said God no longer matters, and church attendances and those professing a belief in God, well, it declined rapidly. From that time, we chased God out of our lives. We've chased God out of our schools, and we've chased God from our land. But who is fighting for the minds and hearts of New Zealand? Show me your laws, and I'll show you your God. In the early part of this millennia, we saw law changes. Yes, we changed laws in order for things to become legal, but were they moral? Why was there such a paradigm shift from what was unlawful to become lawful? We used to convict and imprison people who aborted babies, who sold their babies in prostitution, who engaged in the act of sodomy, who aided the ending of life of others. Now it's legal to do these things. It's even encouraged to do these things that we used to call vile. But they're legal. But are they moral? We used to have police in this country who knew the neighbourhood and they held respect, who was, dare I say, would give the kids a boot up the backside, but not today. Most New Zealand settlements and cities were built around a church. It was the centre of the town. Now it's just a good cafe or maybe a beer hall. Back in about 2010 at the church I was attending in Whitianga, I was present when a man whose name has since long been forgotten, but not his message. He kept referring to the winds of change were coming. The winds of change were coming, he would say, and how they would envelop this country. Now, his presentation has stayed with me mainly because of the forcefulness of his winds of change delivery, which was often. But I keep asking, who is after the hearts and minds of New Zealanders? And the thing about wind is you don't see it, but you can both see and feel its effects. And it isn't that where we are today. The winds of change have been blowing across this nation for well over 2 decades, and, we missed it. So that brings me to the first of our topics, and that is pray. That is spelled P-R-A-Y, not P-R-E-Y, as a few former members of the clergy in days gone by interpreted it. Now, oddly enough, I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on this subject because it's quite clear. We need to be praying for a turnaround in the direction this country is heading. So I hear you say, pray. For some, they have no idea how to pray, but maybe getting down on your knees, closing your eyes and starting a conversation with God, thank Him for life itself, and then ask Him for His blessing on this country to have minds, thoughts and hearts changed for the betterment of you and your neighbours. Pretty simple. You don't have to do a Judith Collins and, just pop into a church while you're having the media present. You can just pray wherever you are comfortable. And the car's a great place, at home, wherever. Remember the words of the psalmist, blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. And if we want a restoration of blessings the earlier generations enjoyed, we need to put our God back into our family. We need to put God back into our communities. We need to put God back into our schools. We need to put God back into our workplace. We need to put God back into our law and order. We need to put God back into our decision making in Parliament. But above all, we need to put God back into our lives. Now there, my friends, is a list of things that we can pray for. Now moving on to our next heading, vote. Isaiah 5:20, woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Today in politics, we're seeing a lot of that happening. Over the past 5 years, or possibly before that, we've seen and been subjected to so much spin from our politicians and business leaders, greatly aided by the former truth tellers and journalists of history, the media. Now, before I get into the subject of politics, as some of you know, I came from a media background. As a journalist, particularly the print media, it was impressed upon me that what I wrote would be a snapshot of history. So it was important that how I wrote was the story of the time. It was other people's stories, and beware, they'd say, don't put your own thoughts into the story you write. One project I worked on was the 50th anniversary of a community paper, which I had to write as a synopsis for the past 50 years. And through the stories written, I had a sense of the community and how people lived and just how much had changed. I got a sense of what the community valued, and reading through the years, you could sense those values had changed. Today's media is all about them, their thoughts and opinions. Even there is a mention of the subject in the story, you'll find it leans a certain direction. To be honest, if stories matched the clickbait used as a headline, it'd be interesting reading. When I worked in the media, it was a privilege to be trusted to write other people's stories and report balanced views of the day. So back to the current political situation. Let me just give you some thoughts. Law and order. The township of Apotiki. The police minister, Ginny Anderson, claims police acted correctly in closing roads for over 2 hours, denying law-abiding citizens egress on the roads, while the mongrel mob had a free pass. She's recently attacked New Zealand prison system, says it's no place for Maori offenders, prisoners for non-Maori. Now this is the same police minister who has spun that we're safer with 1,800 more frontline police officers on the beat to keep people safe. In that number, she wasn't including the dairy owners who are now imprisoned by bars on their business, and the countless numbers of retail workers who are terrified about going to work where they may be injured during a robbery or, a worst case scenario, beaten and killed. What for? A pack of cigarettes. Let's not overlook the 23-year-old man who raped and sexually abused a young girl, including pinning her down and choking her. He received a discount of a sentence because he told the judge prison would be difficult. Now, our health minister, Aisha Verrill, is allowing ethnicity to be put ahead of need for operations, who tells us it's not true. Let's not forget the various ministers of the Crown who denied the rights and the freedoms of New Zealanders during the pandemic. Now, our housing. We hear millions of dollars being spent on housing just for Maori. Now, if my memory serves me correctly, wasn't this the plan for Imahato a few years back, to build housing with some designated housing for Maori? You know, we all remember the standoff between the developers, Fletchers, and local iwi. And let's not forget the intervention of Prime Minister Ardern and the $30 million from the taxpayer chequebook. So what's happened to Imahato? Is it being used for Maori housing? Well, no. Well, building has been carried out, but no housing. A 7,000 square metre Science of the Soul study centre for an Indian religious sect has been built amongst the distinctive stone walls of the historic Otautau Stonefields Historic Reserve, which was the focus of the controversial Imahato occupation. Abortion. You know, we're such a caring nation, but a story which missed the media was the case of a child which was born after surviving an attempt during a late-term abortion. But medical staff were not allowed to aid it, and it took 2 hours to die. It was just left on the bench. But from the moment the child was born, it was no longer a fetus, according to law, and was legally a child, and yet was left to die. Well, shame on all those involved. And that, my friends, is a legacy of government policy on abortion. You know, I've had plenty to say about our education curriculum and as the alphabet mafia's freedom to groom our children to the unnatural. Now, I won't speak any more about them, as we're under a warning of being banned from some social media platforms for speaking truth. But on what planet does a mandate protest to get jail time and a multiple child rapist get home detention? On what planet is governance decided by ethnicity and race? On what planet does 50% of the population get forced to accept that, in fact, their appearance only determines that separation? And in what universe do our unelected governors collectively get to decide laws that criminalise expression of thoughts? You know, it's not the existential or theory as groupthink psychosis, where ethical and moral values succeed to fear of punishment that has no crime. It's even worse than Orwell ever imagined. Look, I could go on, but now here's an awakening, and people are saying, how did our country change? It's changed socially, culturally and morally all by stealth. Right now, our government is enacting a policy on co-governance. Now, you probably haven't heard much of it this year because they said they've shelved plans for it, but it's still happening. Last month, we saw the introduction of a multi-million-dollar extension of Te Pai Oranga, a scheme where Maori offenders are placed before community panels instead of courts. I'll tell you how we got this way, because you exercised your vote without thinking through the short and long-term ramifications for the country. Right now, I'm not telling you how you should vote, nor am I endorsing any party. How you vote is your decision, but I ask you to exercise your right thoughtfully and urge you to vote. Christians, will often feel reluctant to put their faith into anything other than God's kingdom, but I remind you that governments, good or bad, are in place because of God's authority. As Christians, we should not see politics as the primary answer, though, to New Zealand's problems, and we should avoid confusing or compromising the gospel with world political ideologies. Jesus made a point in his Sermon on the Mount for his followers to be salt and light. By exercising your right to vote, you're adding salt into the culture. But with prayerful and careful voting, let's do what we can to strengthen a proper Christian presence and voice in our parliament. Since MMP began in 96, there's been Christian values or Christian-friendly parties, including current contenders. Why? Because Christianity still makes up a sizable bloc. Dr. Stuart Lang from the New Zealand Christian Network in his recent newsletter observed that politics is a highly demanding and complicated environment. Those Christian MPs who are already in Parliament very much need our support, especially in prayer. It should also be noted, though, that those who have made it in the past enter Parliament with a great Christian ideal, and yet they leave Parliament very much like their secular counterparts, defeated by having to vote for things that may be questionable and perhaps against their own conscience. I've only touched on some of the shenanigans of our politicians, but every time they open their mouths, I often wonder if calling them Muppets is insulting to Kermit and Miss Piggy. But honestly, when you hear the leader of a party suggest condensation on windows disproportionately affects Maori and Pacifica. To Party Maori leader Waweri Waititi, and I quote, "Damp windows did not exist before Pākehā colonists invaded the Aotearoa Motu. Come on, stop rolling your eyes. I can't make this stuff up. Let's just say we understand that this country is economically and morally broke, and what is needed is leadership, something we don't have at present. It's hard to look at the incumbents vying for the job. There's a dearth of leadership material, although one in particular looks a possibility, but politics is rough, and it's going to take someone with leadership strength to lift this country out of the mire. Quite frankly, I've had it up to here with all parties. I want a plan. I don't want to be told that 2 + 2 now equals 5, because it doesn't. I don't want politicians to tell me there's 50 shades of grey. And I'm sure you'll agree when I say I don't want a government who can't define what a woman is or can't tell the difference between what is natural and unnatural. The time to stop this contextual morality, it's time where a government is going to lead in the first place they need to start from is from a foundation of truth. Remember truth? We're living in a relevant time right now where truth has been discarded. People are resorting to relativism about everything. Truth is not flexible. It's solid and unyielding. Truth liberates. Truth rebuilds. Truth restores. Truth heals. Truth transforms. Truth prevails. You do not change truth. Truth changes you. Amen? Earlier I mentioned how New Zealanders were prepared to take to the streets because they stood for a cause. And that brings me to the third subject of our meeting, stand. There's just so much we as a nation should be standing up for. Over the past meetings, I've given you numerous topics, but I've come back to this. If we stand up for something, we must be sure we believe in it 100%. Think back to last century and how many people have given their lives for what they stood for. If you're going to draw a line in the sand, you better be sure it's something that you're prepared to give up everything for. Last month, a Christian teacher in New Zealand was fired, struck off the register, which means he can never ever teach again because it was against his conscience to buy into the culture. And he took a stand and refused to call a pupil by his assigned pronoun. My friends, how strong are you in your belief in God? It's finally happening in New Zealand. We've been reading about the left's intolerance to God happening overseas. Friends, what happened with this teacher in Bethlehem College in Tauranga is just beginning. Believe me, your faith is going to be tested. So make a stand, but make sure you're equipped with the answer, 2 Timothy 4:2. The clearer we hear our call from God, the more courage we'll have to face the spiritual battles ahead of us. Our faithfulness should keep us praying for New Zealand to return to God. We want to be strong, courageous, gracious, but uncompromising as witnesses to the gospel of Jesus Christ amidst a culture of increasing hostility towards the Christian faith. When Jesus said, "You're the salt of the earth," he was saying, you're the preservative of a decaying culture. We as Christians, followers of Christ, must look and ask what faithfulness looks like in New Zealand and understand why it's lost its way. We need to accept our nation as under the judgment of God. From today, and as I put you on notice, from today we must learn how to conduct ourselves as a minority in a majority post-Christian era. We need to know and be confident on engaging the culture without being contaminated by it. And we need to be taking that truth to the world who's in bondage to darkness. So let's pray. Let's pray. When the opportunity presents, let's engage as Christian citizens in a God-honouring, legal way. Let's stand for that truth, no matter what the opposition says or whoever may try to cancel us. So I end by leaving you with this thought. Since we're not dead, we're not done. We've heard it, so let's do it.